My book, it's quite critical of the press, and I think they deserve a lot of criticism. I don't hate the press, and I don't hate the people in the press. And in the past couple of years, we've seen books from conservatives, Ann Coulter, Bernie Goldberg. People on the right, I think, really hate the press, and I think they despise journalists in a really odd, sort of peculiar loathing that I don't understand. I love journalism, and that's why I wrote the book. I think it needs to be better and stronger, and I admire journalists, and I think there is some great journalism, and I talk about it in the book. But that being said, it needs to be better, and it needs to be more aggressive, and it needs to hold people in power accountable. But again, my book, I don't call people names, and I don't, suggest they're not patriotic or they're things. I mean, I leave that to the Ann Coulters of the world. I clearly come at this book from a liberal perspective. I don't pretend to be sort of an academic or a journalism professor. So, and I think anyone who reads that, it'll be clear. That said, I think I'm extraordinarily fair, again, unlike some of the conservative attacks on the press. I mean, it's all documented. I think there are 700 or 800 footnotes. Hopefully, I got everything right. In terms of objective, I come at this from a liberal perspective, but I do think I'm extraordinarily fair in terms of the points that I make. What'll probably go down as history as the press's worst error or most extraordinary example of timidity during the Bush years was probably the run up to the war and the debate over weapons of mass destruction. It's quite clear now that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And if you go back and look at the newspaper and the TV reports from, say, the summer of 2002 to the invasion of 2003, the press just did an abominable job, considering the number of very high-profile critics, either within the administration, within the CIA, or just think tank people that were trying, as hard as they could to raise red flags. But the press just wasn't really interested in hearing that. I mean, there's been well-documented studies in terms of the people that the networks were having on TV during the run-up to war. Overwhelmingly, all of them were in support of the war. And then if you talk about the Judy Miller reporting at the New York Times, and which turned into a huge fiasco for the newspaper and severely damaged the reputation. So I think 10, 20, even 50 years from now, people will still be talking about the press and how it completely fell down during the run-up to the Iraq War. I mean, even the New York Times public editor or ombudsman just a few months ago essentially said America went to war because of the press's failings, and it's hard to think of a more grave error than that. In terms of how timid the press was during Bush, particularly if from 2000 to 2005, I describe in my book as sort of this palace court or almost sort of a gentlemanly approach. I think you'd have to go back to sort of the Eisenhower years to find a press corps that was so sort of timid and just sort of accepted the administration's word. I mean, even if you went back to Richard Nixon, right, before Watergate, I mean, he was enormously popular. It was a wartime era that White House was known to play hardball with the press, has sort of had an open contempt for the press. So I think there were a lot of similarities between Nixon and the Bush White House. But even then, I don't think the D.C. Press was as forgiving and nervous and insecure as the press was covering Bush, say, from 2000 to 2005. The terms of liberal and conservative, liberal is clearly a dirty word, sort of in American politics. And if you talk about the media, I think one of the reasons the press has been so timid with Bush is they are absolutely afraid of being called liberal. The right has done a very effective job sort of demonizing the press. There's this cliche about the liberal media. And I think people inside the Beltway go to extraordinary lengths to prove that they're not liberal, and no one wants to be liberal, et cetera. But that being said, I mean, as the Bush White House continues to sort of unravel, Bush is now seriously in jeopardy of dipping below 30% in approval ratings. There's widespread contempt for his handling of the war. Who knows? I mean, in a couple of years, conservative might be a dirty word. I think in light of the invasion of Iraq, certainly neoconservative and the ideologues that push for the war, I mean, that sort of has taken on sort of a nasty connotation. It's possible that the conservative will be sort of tossed around the same way liberal is, but again, it's not there yet. And I think the press has been way too nervous about being dubbed, too liberal or liberal bias. And I think that's one of the reasons they sort of lost their bearings during the Bush years. Hopefully the message of the book is the press needs to do a better job. The press lost its way. The press treats Democrats and Republicans differently. I mean, if you go back and you think about the extraordinary zeal that the press showed during the Clinton years, and even before, Monica arrived on the scene, whether it was Whitewater or supposedly selling, secrets to China for campaign fund. We forget how many quote unquote scandals the press, claimed to have uncovered during the Clinton years. And then for them to make such an extraordinary U-turn, literally on the day, George Bush was sworn into office, and then to go down this path of, almost unprecedented timidity. I mean, I think there's something just fundamentally happened to journalism, and it was not for the better. More importantly, it hurt the public dialogue, and I think news consumers suffered. So the point of my book is something went seriously wrong, and my point is to document it, and then hopefully there can be a larger debate about where the press should go and how something like this isn't repeated in the near future.